Ark Raiders has one of the most quietly unsettling worlds in gaming right now. And in this video, I'm going to walk you through every theoretically possible event, hidden implication, and lore detail that the game either hints at or outright buries. And there is a lot more than most people realize. I want to be upfront about something before we get into this. I put this video together because I kept noticing details in Ark Raiders that weren't being talked about anywhere. The lore is fragmented on purpose. It lives in item descriptions, loading screen text, ambient dialogue, and environmental storytelling. When I started pulling those pieces together, a picture emerged that was genuinely more interesting than I expected. I made a deliberate choice to organize this chronologically where possible, but to shift into thematic groupings when the timeline gets murky, which it does often. I also chose to leave certain fan theories out entirely if they didn't have at least 2 points of in-game support. Everything here is an interpretation. The game suggests, points toward, and implies. Very little is stated outright, and I think that's intentional. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. The World Before the Ark. To understand what Ark Raiders is really about, you have to first understand what the world looked like before the Ark arrived. The game drops you into a post-collapse surface environment, but it rarely explains what the society that existed before looked like in any detail. That absence is itself a form of storytelling. What we can reconstruct from scattered item descriptions and environmental clues points toward a highly automated, resource-stretched civilization that had already begun fracturing long before any machines fell from the sky. The underground settlements, called T. Salvador, and its surrounding tunnel networks suggest that humanity had already begun retreating underground for reasons unrelated to the Ark. There are references in certain storage crate labels and logistics manifests to pre-Ark supply shortages and rationing systems. This points toward a world that was already under significant pressure before the machines appeared. The Ark didn't create a desperate humanity, it encountered one. The economic language embedded in item flavor text is striking. Words like reclaimed, redistribution quota, and decommissioned unit appear in descriptions for pre-Ark equipment. These aren't the words of a stable, thriving civilization. They're the vocabulary of scarcity management. The society that built the underground infrastructure appears to have done so as a defensive measure against conditions that were already deteriorating on the surface. What caused that deterioration is never stated outright. One possible reading is environmental collapse. The surface landscape in Ark Raiders is not just war-damaged. Vegetation patterns, soil coloration, and the behavior of certain non-Ark fauna suggest long-term environmental stress predating the mechanical invasion. This isn't definitive, but it points toward a world that had already begun to die before the Ark accelerated that process. The underground cities themselves are a fascinating archaeological record. Their architecture mixes utilitarian industrial design with what appear to be repurposed civic structures. You can find what looks like it was once a community center converted into a weapons depot, a school corridor turned into a supply route. These conversions speak to a rapid, pragmatic response to crisis, rather than a planned underground society. Someone decided, quickly, that the surface was becoming uninhabitable, and they worked with what they had. Pre-Ark technology in the game is notably different from what the Ark's machines use. Human equipment is analog adjacent, robust, and repairable. It has a worn, iterative quality, suggesting many generations of incremental improvement rather than sudden leaps. This stands in contrast to Ark technology, which appears discontinuous. It doesn't look like the next stage of human engineering. It looks like something designed by a completely separate problem-solving logic. The power infrastructure that the underground settlements rely on suggests pre-Ark humanity had developed significant geothermal and subsurface energy technology. This wasn't improvised after the invasion. The depth and scale of the energy systems suggest long-term planning. Someone anticipated needing to sustain large populations underground indefinitely. The question of when that planning began is one the game leaves open but makes you ask, Social structures visible in the underground environment suggest a collapse of pre-existing governance rather than a smooth transition to new authority. The faction dynamics you navigate as a raider point toward competing power centers that emerged from the chaos rather than pre-planned leadership structures. No single faction appears to have been in charge before the arc. This suggests that whatever government existed on the surface either collapsed early or was never capable of managing the crisis effectively. Trade goods and currency systems implied in vendor interactions point toward an economy that evolved extremely rapidly in the post-arc environment. The things that have value underground are almost entirely practical: consumables, repair materials, functional tools. Decorative or luxury items appear almost nowhere. This total reorientation of value suggests a society that shed its previous economic assumptions very quickly, which implies those assumptions were not deeply held or were easily abandoned under pressure. The elderly NPCs in underground settlements are particularly interesting data points. They represent a generation that has pre-arc memories. Their dialogue, where audible, is terse and pragmatic rather than nostalgic. They don't talk much about what the world was like before. This could be read as collective trauma, pragmatic survival focus, or deliberate suppression. Any of those readings is consistent with what the game shows you. Certain facility structures in the underground appear to predate the rest of the settlement construction by a significant margin. These older sections use different materials, different construction methods, and sometimes different lighting infrastructure. This layering suggests the underground wasn't built all at once. Some of it was already there before the arc arrived. The question of what it was originally built for is one the game never answers, but the architecture suggests it was industrial rather than residential. The medical infrastructure visible in certain underground zones is extensive relative to the apparent population. Large treatment areas, significant pharmaceutical storage, and specialized equipment that would only make sense for managing a high volume of injured or ill patients. This scale of medical preparation is either a response to the ongoing surface conflict or evidence of a pre-arc public health crisis that required similar infrastructure. Both are possible. One possible reading is that both were happening simultaneously. Communication technology in the underground settlements is a curious mix. There are extremely advanced signal processing systems sitting alongside what looks like improvised shortwave radio equipment. The advanced systems have a specific visual language that resembles arc technology more than pre-arc human design. This detail is easy to miss, but potentially significant. It suggests that at some point, someone in the underground either reverse-engineered arc communication systems or acquired them through means the game doesn't explain. The food production systems, visible in the deeper sections of the underground, are sophisticated in ways that suggest serious long-term planning. Hydroponic systems, protein synthesis equipment, and what appear to be seed banking facilities all point toward a population that expected to be underground for generations, not months or years. This level of preparation is inconsistent with the idea that the arc arrival was a complete surprise to everyone. Some people apparently had time to prepare. This raises a question the game plants but doesn't answer. Who had that time, and how did they get it? If certain factions or individuals were able to establish long-term food security before the worst of the arc incursions, they either had advance warning, or they were already planning for some kind of surface collapse independent of the arc. Either possibility changes how you think about the political landscape of the underground. Children in the underground environments are almost entirely absent from the visible population. The settlements appear populated primarily by adults of working age. This demographic gap could reflect many things, but one possible interpretation is that the population we see represents a survivor selection rather than a cross-section of the original human population. The people who made it underground in sufficient numbers to sustain settlements may have been disproportionately from certain occupational or social groups. The psychological state of underground residents, communicated through ambient dialogue and behavioral animations, is one of contained stress rather than active despair. People are functional. They work, they trade, they argue. But there is a flatness to the emotional register that suggests long-term adaptation to a profoundly constrained existence. This is not a population in acute crisis. It's a population that has normalized a situation that should not be normal. Raider culture, the subculture you as the player belong to, represents something interesting within this underground society. Raiders are people who go to the surface voluntarily, in a community where the surface is associated with death and mechanical predation. Voluntary surface exposure requires a specific psychological profile. The game suggests raiders are tolerated rather than celebrated by the broader underground population. They are necessary but slightly suspect. The economic role of raiders within the underground economy is clearly significant. The materials they bring back from the surface sustain industries and technologies that cannot be produced underground. This creates a dependency that the underground population appears uncomfortable with. There is a tension between needing what raiders provide and resenting the implication that the underground cannot be self-sufficient without surface resources. Faction dynamics among the underground settlements suggest that resource control rather than ideological difference is the primary driver of conflict. The factions don't appear to disagree in any meaningful way about the nature of the Ark or humanity's response to it. They disagree about who controls what, who gets what, and who has authority over shared infrastructure. This is scarcity politics, not ideological war, and it's a portrait of a society that has compressed all its conflict into its most fundamental material form. The underground architecture includes what appear to be memorial spaces, rooms, or alcoves that have no practical function but contain objects arranged with deliberate care, personal effects, photographs, items that clearly belong to people no longer present. These spaces are maintained, not abandoned. Someone is keeping them. This suggests that grief and memory remain important functions within the underground community, even as practical survival dominates daily life. Certain underground zones contain equipment that appears to have been deliberately disabled rather than simply worn out or destroyed. Machinery with components removed in ways that suggest intentional decommissioning, communication arrays with their core processing units extracted. These deliberate disablements suggest decisions were made at some point to limit certain capabilities within the underground. Who made those decisions, and why is a question the game raises without answering. The lighting design in the underground is worth noting as an environmental storytelling element. Different zones use different lighting temperatures and intensities in ways that seem to correspond to their social function. Working areas use harsh, practical light. Rest areas use warmer, dimmer light. The memorial spaces use a specific cool blue that is consistent across different underground locations, suggesting a deliberate design choice rather than accident. Someone standardized the visual language of remembrance. Water infrastructure in the underground is presented as a major source of political tension. The pipes, filtration systems, and distribution networks appear to be among the most contested resources in the underground political landscape. This makes sense practically, but the specific way the tension is presented suggests that water infrastructure was strategically concentrated at some point, possibly to create leverage rather than for efficiency reasons. Someone built the water system to be a political tool. The educational infrastructure visible in the underground is almost entirely practical and vocational. There are training facilities for mechanical repair, medical procedures, and combat skills. There is no visible infrastructure for the kind of broad intellectual education that a pre-Ark society would presumably have valued. This isn't necessarily evidence of deliberate suppression. It may simply reflect the brutal prioritization of survival needs, but it does mean that the underground population is being prepared for function, not for thought about the larger situation they're in. Security infrastructure in the underground settlements is extensive relative to the apparent external threat. The Ark machines are the primary danger on the surface, but the internal security systems in underground settlements appear designed to manage internal population control as much as external defense. Checkpoints, monitoring systems, and access restriction architecture all suggest that the people running these settlements are as concerned about internal dissent as they are about Ark incursion. Pre-Ark artifacts occasionally appear in underground environments as decorative objects, conversation pieces, or items of obscure sentimental value. Books, printed photographs, physical media formats. These objects are clearly non-functional in any practical sense, but they are present, and they are preserved. The underground population has not entirely abandoned its pre-Ark cultural identity. It maintains small, private connections to the world that existed before. Tool design in the underground speaks to a fascinating engineering philosophy. Most tools are designed to be multi-purpose, easily repaired, and fabricated from commonly available materials. This design philosophy is so consistent that it suggests a deliberate standardization program rather than organic development. Someone decided what tools the underground society would use and built the infrastructure to produce them. That level of intentional standardization implies a degree of centralized planning that isn't otherwise visible in the apparently fragmented political landscape. The role of music and sound in the underground environment is subtle but present. Certain ambient areas include what sounds like recorded or live music at very low volume. Musical instruments appear occasionally in personal quarters. This is not a society that has abandoned all non-utilitarian cultural production. The presence of music in spaces associated with rest and personal time suggests that cultural continuity is maintained in private, even when it's invisible in public. Underground settlements occasionally have areas that appear to be off-limits to the player without explicit explanation. These spaces exist in the architecture, but are inaccessible. Their size and placement suggest they are not simply maintenance corridors. Some of them appear, from their ventilation and utility connections, to be residential spaces for a significant number of people. The implication that there are sections of the underground population that are deliberately separated from the radar-accessible areas is one the game never addresses directly. The legal and regulatory frameworks implied by various document fragments in the underground suggest an evolving system that hasn't settled into stable form. Rules appear to be made and revised frequently. Punishments, implied in various posted notices, vary in severity in ways that seem inconsistent, suggesting either multiple competing rulemaking bodies or a single system under constant pressure and revision. This is the legal framework of a society still figuring itself out under extreme duress. Pre-Ark personal items that make their way into the underground as collector objects or sentimental relics include technology that would have been extremely expensive or rare before the collapse. This implies that the social stratification of the pre-Ark world has been largely dissolved in the underground, or at least redistributed. Objects that once marked wealth now mark memory. The economic meaning has been stripped away and replaced with emotional meaning. The relationship between underground settlements and the surface in Ark Raiders is fundamentally one of necessary engagement with a hostile environment. Raiders aren't adventurers seeking glory. They're workers performing an extremely dangerous job that sustains the underground's viability. This framing gives the game's core gameplay loop a weight that it might otherwise lack. You're not a hero, you're a laborer. Rumors and unverified information circulate in the underground in ways that the game makes audible if you pay attention to ambient NPC dialogue. These rumors touch on everything from Ark behavior patterns to the possibility of uncontacted human settlements on the surface, to theories about what the Ark actually wants. The diversity and persistence of these rumors suggests a population that is desperately trying to make sense of a situation that has resisted explanation for a very long time. The position of raiders within the underground social hierarchy is ambiguous. On one hand, they provide irreplaceable material value. On the other hand, their behavioral profile, comfort with surface exposure, tolerance for extreme risk, and the cultural identity that seems to develop among raider communities makes them somewhat alien to the broader underground population. Raiders appear to form sub-communities within the settlements that have their own norms and social rules distinct from the surrounding population. Children who are present in the underground, though rare, appear to be raised with an unusual degree of practical education from very young ages. The implication in the game's visual language is that childhood, as a protected developmental period, has been compressed by necessity. Young people in the underground appear to be treated as small adults rather than as a separate developmental category. This reflects the resource and survival pressures of the environment, but also raises questions about what kind of psychological adults this environment will produce. The underground settlements maintain what appear to be archives of pre-Ark information. These aren't just practical, technical manuals. They include what look like historical records, cultural documents, and possibly artistic works preserved in various physical or digital formats. Someone decided that preserving non-practical information was worth the storage cost, which implies a long-term view of survival that goes beyond immediate material needs. Someone is thinking about what kind of civilization emerges from the underground, not just whether it survives. The specific factions the player interacts with in Ark Raiders each appear to control a different critical resource or capability. This division could be coincidental, the result of who happened to be where when the underground was being established, or it could suggest a deliberate carving up of essential capabilities that was negotiated at some point. The latter possibility implies a degree of early coordination that would be at odds with the apparent fragmentation of current underground politics. Abandoned sections of the underground, areas that were once occupied and are now empty, appear throughout the game environment. These abandoned zones have a specific character. They're not destroyed. Equipment is left in place. Personal effects are occasionally still present. This is not the aftermath of violence or disaster. It's the aftermath of departure. People left these areas intentionally. The question of where they went and why is one the game leaves entirely open. The surface environment, visible from underground entry points, gives glimpses of an outside world that is dramatically different from what the underground population appears to imagine it to be. Surface conditions in Ark Raiders vary significantly by zone. Some areas are more hostile than others. Some have been more thoroughly altered by Ark activity. The implication is that the underground population's understanding of the surface is incomplete and possibly significantly wrong, which has real implications for how they're making decisions about resources, planning, and the future. Pre-Ark currency occasionally appears as a physical artifact in the game world. It has no exchange value in underground commerce, but it is preserved by some individuals. This detail suggests that some members of the underground population maintain an emotional or symbolic connection to the economic system that existed before, even though that system is functionally dead. Whether this represents a hope for restoration or simply a form of grief is left for the player to decide. The environmental sound design in underground spaces carries a subtle but consistent texture of distant mechanical sound, not Ark machines, but the hum and groan of the underground infrastructure itself. This sound is the sonic signature of a civilization sustaining itself through constant mechanical effort. The underground is not a quiet refuge. It is a working machine, and its population lives inside that machine, dependent on its continued function. Certain item descriptions reference a period immediately following the initial Ark arrival that is described in terms suggesting near total chaos. The vocabulary used, words pointing toward mass displacement, rapid infrastructure failure, and catastrophic resource loss, is more extreme than what the current underground environment implies. The current settlements appear to be the survivors of something much worse. The world you're operating in is already the rebuilt version, not the initial catastrophe. The rebuilding that produced the current underground environment appears to have involved significant loss of population and knowledge. Technologies that the pre-Ark world would have considered basic infrastructure are absent or degraded in the underground. The reconstruction was selective. What was rebuilt was what served immediate survival. Much of what made pre-Ark civilization complex and culturally rich did not survive the transition. Operational security in the underground settlements is treated as a serious concern in ways that go beyond simple protection from Ark incursion. Communication protocols, information compartmentalization, and restrictions on what can be discussed in certain spaces all suggest that the underground leadership is managing information carefully. The question of what information they're managing and why is one of the more interesting open threads the game leaves running. The physical design of underground settlement spaces reflects an interesting tension between efficiency and human psychological needs. Pure efficiency would produce environments that maximize resource use at the expense of comfort and personal space. What you see in Ark Raiders is a compromise that includes small but genuine concessions to human psychological needs. Rest areas with slightly more space than strictly necessary. Small personal decoration tolerated in work areas. This compromise suggests leadership that understands human psychology, at least minimally, and is trying to maintain functional morale rather than simply extracting maximum utility from its population. The game's treatment of death and loss within the underground community is understated, but present. Mortality is managed practically. Resources are redistributed quickly when someone dies. But there are consistent small rituals visible in the environment, suggesting that even in this pragmatic culture, death is not treated as purely a logistical event. The balance between practical management of loss and the emotional acknowledgement of it is one of the more quietly human aspects of the world the game builds. The Ark Raiders player character occupies a specific position in this world that is worth reflecting on before we move into the Ark's own story. You are not a soldier. You are not a leader. You are a person who has adapted to the surface well enough to make a living there, which makes you simultaneously valuable and slightly alien to the underground community you nominally belong to. The game's structural choice to make you a worker rather than a hero is a lore decision as much as a gameplay one. It shapes the entire texture of the world and your place in it. Chapter 2: What we know about the Ark. The Ark itself is the central mystery of Ark Raiders, and deliberately so. Everything about how the game presents Ark machinery and behavior suggests that the designers want you to sit with uncertainty rather than arrive at comfortable explanations. This chapter is about what the game's environmental storytelling, item descriptions, and observable machine behavior actually suggests about the Ark's nature, purpose, and origin. Most of this is interpretation. The game points towards things without confirming them, but the directions it points are consistent enough to be worth following. The name itself is worth starting with. Ark Raiders gives the enemy faction a name that functions as an astronomical and electrical reference simultaneously. An arc can refer to a segment of a circle, to an electrical discharge, or to a trajectory through space. All three meanings are potentially relevant to what the arc appears to be doing on the surface. This isn't definitive lore, but the name choice is unlikely to be accidental in a game that is otherwise so deliberate in its environmental storytelling. Arc machines visible in the game fall into recognizable behavioral categories. There are machines that appear to be engaged in collection or harvesting activity. There are machines that function as defensive or patrol units protecting those collection activities. There are machines that appear to be engaged in construction or modification of the surface environment. And there are machines whose purpose is not immediately obvious. This differentiation suggests an organized, goal-directed system rather than indiscriminate destruction. The collection behavior of certain Arc units is one of the more significant lore details in the game. These machines gather specific materials and transport them in ways that suggest a supply chain rather than simple scavenging. If the Arc is collecting resources and moving them somewhere, the question of where and why is enormous. The game never shows you the destination of those collections, which is itself a form of storytelling. The Arc has a purpose that extends beyond what you can see. Arc construction activity on the surface is visible in environmental details that suggest long-term modification of the landscape rather than short-term occupation. Structures built by Arc machines have a permanence and scale that implies they aren't temporary installations. They are designed to last. This points toward a long-term plan rather than a simple extraction operation. Something is being built, over time, in the ruins of the human surface world. The behavior of Arc machines in combat is revealing in ways that pure gameplay analysis might miss. These machines don't appear to prioritize the elimination of humans as their primary goal. They respond to human presence as an interference with their primary activities. This suggests that humans are not the target of the Arc, they are an obstacle. This distinction is significant because it implies that the Arc's agenda exists independently of humanity, and that human destruction is a side effect rather than an objective. Certain Arc units exhibit behaviors that are difficult to explain as purely functional. Patrol patterns that are more elaborate than necessary for simple area denial, reactions to specific environmental conditions that go beyond practical threat response. One possible reading of these behaviors is that the ARC machines are not purely tool-like in their operation. They may have something that functions like attention, curiosity, or aesthetic preference, though projecting human psychological categories onto them is obviously a methodological risk. The visual design of ARC machines is worth analyzing as law. Their forms suggest adaptation to a specific set of tasks rather than a generalized robotic design aesthetic. Different units are specialized in ways that imply a larger design system, where form follows function extremely precisely. This level of specialization suggests that whoever or whatever designed the ARC had very specific operational requirements in mind. The machines are not prototypes or experiments, they are refined solutions to defined problems. ARC machine damage states are interesting from a law perspective. Damaged ARC units don't simply stop functioning when sufficiently damaged. They exhibit altered behaviors that sometimes make them more dangerous and sometimes make them erratic in ways that suggest a loss of higher-order direction. This behavioral shift under damage could imply a hierarchical control structure where lower-level reflex behavior continues after higher-level goal direction is disrupted. The machines may be more architecturally complex than they appear. The sounds produced by ARC machines carry a specific audio design that merits attention. Beyond functional mechanical sounds, ARC units produce tones and frequencies that have a musical or signal-like quality. These sounds vary in ways that appear correlated with machine state and activity, rather than being simply ambient noise. One possible reading is that ARC machines communicate through acoustic signals as well as whatever electronic communication they presumably use. What they might be communicating, and to whom, is an open question the game leaves entirely unanswered. Environmental modifications made by ARC machines over time show a consistency that implies they are following a plan rather than improvising. Areas that have been under ARC influence for longer periods are modified in ways that suggest progressive stages of a transformation process. If you look at these stages sequentially, they tell a story about an end state that the ARC is working toward. What that end state is cannot be determined from what the game shows, but the fact that there is a progressive sequence is itself significant. The relationship between ARC machines and the natural environment is complex in ways the game makes visible in surface zone design. ARC activity doesn't uniformly destroy biological life. Some areas under ARC influence show suppression of organic life, while others show alteration or apparent cultivation of it. The machines are not simply hostile to organic matter, they appear to be doing something more specific with it, something that varies by location and possibly by stage of whatever process they're engaged in. ARC machine hierarchy, visible in the way units behave relative to each other, suggests a complex organizational structure rather than simple swarm behavior. There are clear differences in authority between unit types. Larger or more complex units appear to coordinate the behavior of smaller ones. This hierarchy raises the question of how it is maintained. Is there centralized command infrastructure somewhere on or above the surface? Are the machines themselves capable of maintaining hierarchical organization without external direction? The apparent absence of any ARC communication with humanity is itself a law detail. The ARC has had extended contact with human civilization. It has observed human behavior extensively during raids, and yet there is no evidence in the game of any ARC attempt to communicate, negotiate, or even acknowledge humanity as anything other than an obstacle. This silence is either evidence that the ARC has nothing to say to humans, or evidence that whatever the ARC is, it doesn't recognize humanity as the kind of entity it would communicate with. ARC technology, when examined as salvage, reveals design principles that are genuinely alien in their logic. Not simply more advanced versions of human engineering, but differently conceived engineering. The solutions ARC technology applies to problems are not ones human engineers would arrive at through the incremental development visible in pre-ARC human technology. This suggests either that the ARC originated from a completely different technological tradition, or that it was designed by a non-human intelligence, or possibly by a post-human one. The energy signatures of arc operations. On the surface are a recurring environmental detail in zone design. Certain areas show evidence of massive energy input from arc activities that goes well beyond what simple extraction or construction would require. This energy expenditure implies either extreme inefficiency in arc operations or operations that require a level of energy that suggests their scale is much larger than visible surface activity implies. The arc may be doing something underground that requires enormous power, and what's visible on the surface is only part of a much larger operation. Arc behavior toward non-human organisms on the surface is a detail the game handles subtly but consistently. Animals and plant life on the surface appear to elicit specific, non-random responses from arc units. Some organisms are ignored entirely, others are collected, others are apparently destroyed. The pattern of these responses suggests that arc machines are making distinctions between organisms based on criteria that aren't obvious from observation. Whatever the arc is interested in, it isn't simply everything organic or everything inorganic. It is something more specific. The seasonal or temporal patterns of arc surface activity are hinted at in certain item descriptions and NPC dialogue. Arc operations don't appear to be uniform over time. There are periods of increased activity and periods of relative quiet. These cycles don't map onto any obvious human schedule or environmental pattern. They appear to be driven by arc priorities rather than external conditions. The existence of a cycle implies planning or a program being executed rather than opportunistic behavior. Certain surface zones contain arc structures that appear to be observational in purpose. Elevated platforms, sensor arrays, structures with clear lines of sight over large areas. These observational installations are positioned in ways that suggest systematic mapping or monitoring of specific areas rather than general surveillance. The arc is watching certain things carefully. The question of what it is, watching and why, is one of those details the game plants and leaves growing in the back of your mind. The interaction between different arc unit types during complex operations reveals something about how the system coordinates. Individual units appear to have limited awareness of the overall operation they're contributing to. Their behavior is locally coherent, but doesn't obviously reflect awareness of the global objective. This is consistent with a distributed intelligence model, where overall behavior emerges from many individually limited units following local rules. If that's the ARC's organizational model, it implies a very different kind of intelligence from what human cognition represents. ARC salvage has economic value in the underground economy, and the specific components that are most valued are interesting from a law perspective. The most economically significant ARC components are those that can be repurposed for human use. This repurposing implies a degree of compatibility between ARC and human technological needs that might not be expected if the two technologies were truly alien to each other. The overlap in functional requirements might suggest a shared origin or shared environmental context. The behavior of ARC machines near underground settlement entry points is a specific law detail worth examining. ARC units don't appear to actively pursue humans into underground spaces. They operate at or above surface level. Whether this is a capability limitation, a strategic choice, or a programmed constraint is unclear from observation alone. But the fact that underground spaces appear to be outside the operational parameters of most ARC units is a significant tactical and potentially law-significant detail. Certain rare ARC unit types behave in ways that suggest they have operational roles not covered by the standard unit categories. These anomalous units are encountered infrequently, but appear consistently in specific locations or under specific conditions. Their behavior suggests functions that don't fit neatly into the harvesting, defense, and construction roles that define most ARC activity. One possible interpretation is that these units represent a different operational tier with responsibilities that are not visible in the surface environment. The visual signature of ARC machine damage versus human weapon damage on the environment is an environmental detail that tells a story about scale and power difference. ARC damage patterns suggest energy release at levels that conventional human weapons don't approach. but Ark machines appear to operate with much greater restraint than their maximum capability would allow. If these machines could bring full destructive force to every encounter with human surface activity, the situation would presumably be worse than it is. The implication is that the Ark is choosing not to maximize its surface impact, which raises the question of why. Arc machines that have been non-functional for extended periods appear in certain zones as environmental objects rather than active threats. The deterioration patterns of these deactivated units are interesting because they suggest a maintenance dependency. Arc machines appear to require some form of ongoing support to remain operational. They are not indefinitely self-sustaining. This dependency implies that the Arc system has a logistics dimension, that there is infrastructure somewhere that sustains its machines, and that disrupting that infrastructure would be consequential. The discovery of Arc components that appear to have been deliberately separated from their original assemblies raises an interesting question. Some salvageable Arc material shows signs of deliberate disassembly rather than combat damage or natural deterioration. Who would disassemble an Arc machine, and why? The most obvious answer is human salvages, and that is likely the correct one in most cases. But some of these disassembled units are in locations that would be extremely dangerous for human salvagers to access, which opens the possibility that Arc machines sometimes disassemble other Arc machines. Arc Raiders gives you repeated exposure to Arc machines without ever quite letting you understand them. This is a deliberate design choice that functions as effective horror, or at least dread. The things you fight are comprehensible enough to engage with tactically, but strange enough to resist full understanding. They have purposes you can observe without understanding. They have behaviors that are consistent without being predictable. They are, in the truest sense, alien, and the game is doing something interesting by making that alienness a persistent feature of the experience rather than a mystery to be solved. Chapter 3: The Surface and its Secrets. The surface world in Arc Raiders is where the game's environmental storytelling is most concentrated. Every zone tells a story about what existed before, what the Ark has done to it, and what might still be possible there. In this chapter, we're going to walk through what the surface environment implies about the history of the Ark incursion, the variety of human response to it, and the specific mysteries that certain zones appear to be deliberately drawing attention to. The surface landscape of Arc Raiders is not uniform. Different zones have different relationships to the Ark's presence, from areas that appear to be active Arc operational zones to areas that show evidence of older, perhaps completed, Arc activity to areas where Arc presence is sparse or absent. This variation is itself a lore detail. The Arc is not doing the same thing everywhere. It is operating selectively, with apparent prioritization of certain locations over others. Surface ruins in Arc Raiders reward close attention because the architecture tells stories about the pre-Arc world that the game doesn't state directly. Building types, construction materials, urban layout patterns, and the relationship between residential, industrial, and civic architecture all paint a picture of the kind of society that existed before. It was not dramatically different from our own. This familiarity is unsettling in context because it makes the loss more palpable. These were recognizable places, and now they are something else. The specific ways that buildings have been damaged on the surface vary in telling ways. Some damage is clearly from Arc machine activity. Other damage patterns suggest human-caused destruction, either during the initial panic of the Ark's arrival or in subsequent conflicts between human groups on the surface. There are also damage patterns that suggest simple neglect and environmental deterioration over years. The layering of these different damage types tells a compressed history of the surface's transformation. Certain surface locations contain evidence of organized human defense efforts. Barricades, weapon emplacements, supply caches, and command posts that were established at some point after the Ark arrived and before they were presumably overrun or abandoned. These defensive positions tell stories about human groups who chose to fight on the surface rather than retreat underground. The outcomes of those fights, visible in the environmental aftermath, are almost universally grim, but the existence of those fights is itself significant. The supply caches left by previous surface occupants or operations are among the most lore-rich objects in the game when you examine their contents closely. What people thought to bring to the surface, what they considered essential, what they were willing to carry into that environment, tells you a great deal about the conditions they were operating in and the objectives they were pursuing. Some caches suggest long-term surface habitation attempts. Others look like quick extraction runs. A few look like someone was planning to be on the surface indefinitely. There is evidence in certain surface zones of human activity that postdates the initial Ark incursion, but predates the current era. Someone was operating on the surface regularly enough to establish semi-permanent installations, and those installations are now abandoned. The gap between those historical activities and the current situation represented by the player character's operations is a significant temporal mystery. What happened in between? Why did those surface operations cease? The distribution of specific Ark unit types across different surface zones is not random. Certain unit types concentrate in specific locations in ways that correspond to particular kinds of surface features. Collection type units concentrate near areas with specific geological or material characteristics. Construction units concentrate near specific Ark installations. This distribution suggests that Ark operations on the surface are organized around specific resources or objectives rather than simple territorial occupation. Natural environments on the surface, areas away from concentrated human ruins, show Ark influence in ways that are more subtle but equally significant. Geological formations in some areas appear to have been modified. Natural watercourses appear to have been altered. The topography of certain zones shows evidence of large-scale ground modification that could only be the result of Ark machine activity over extended periods. The Ark has been reshaping the physical landscape, not just occupying it. The sky above the surface in Ark Raiders is an environmental detail that carries specific implications. The Ark machines that are visible descending or ascending in the background aren't simply combat units. Some of them are clearly transporting significant payloads. The scale of those payloads, relative to the machine sizes visible in-game, implies that the Ark is moving enormous quantities of material off the surface, combined with collection behavior observed at ground level. This aerial traffic suggests an industrial operation at a scale that dwarfs any human activity that has ever taken place on the surface. Certain surface locations show evidence of what appear to be Ark installation failures or incomplete projects. Partially constructed structures, machine components in configurations that suggest interrupted activity, areas that show the beginning of Ark environmental modification, but no completion. These incomplete projects are interesting because they imply that Ark operations are not infallible. Something interrupted them, whether that something was human resistance, resource limitation, or internal Ark prioritization is unclear. The bodies, visible in certain surface locations, which the game doesn't linger on but doesn't hide either, are distributed in ways that tell stories about how people died there. Clusters, near defensive positions, suggest organized resistance that failed. Isolated individuals in unusual locations suggest people who were trying to do something specific when they died. The spatial distribution of the dead is itself a form of environmental narrative that the game uses consistently to communicate what happened in a given location. Structures that appear to have served as observation or communication posts in the human pre-Ark world are present in several surface zones. These locations were presumably valuable for their line-of-sight advantages long before the Ark arrived. Some of them appear to have been converted to human defensive use after the Ark arrived. Some of them have been incorporated into Ark structures. The long history of strategic use visible in these locations connects the pre-Ark world to the post-Ark world in a specific geographical way. The relationship between surface zone connectivity and the underground settlement network is an interesting structural detail. Entry and exit points from the underground appear to be distributed in ways that suggest deliberate mapping of safe or strategically valuable routes, but the current surface conditions make some of those routes more dangerous than they presumably were when the underground exits were originally established. The infrastructure of underground access is a legacy system designed for conditions that no longer fully apply. Seasonal environmental indicators on the surface, the state of vegetation, weather conditions, signs of frost or heat stress in organic material all suggest that the surface world continues to cycle through natural temporal patterns, even in the presence of Ark operations. The Ark has not stopped time or eliminated natural processes. It is operating within a still living natural world, which makes its presence feel less like an apocalypse and more like an occupation. The world continues. The Ark is doing something specific within it. Water on the surface is distributed in ways that create important logistical considerations for surface operations. Natural water sources in certain zones appear to have been modified by Ark activity, either disrupted or diverted. In other zones, water sources appear intact. The pattern of water modification by Ark activity doesn't obviously correlate with resource extraction needs, which suggests the modifications may serve a different purpose, possibly related to Ark construction requirements or large-scale processes being conducted underground. Plant life on the surface tells a compressed story about the ecological consequences of Ark activity over time. Species compositions in different zones reflect different histories of Ark influence. Areas with long-term heavy Ark presence show different biological communities than areas with limited Ark contact. This ecological differentiation is a form of evidence for the timeline of Ark operations, suggesting that certain areas have been under Ark influence for much longer than others. Human-made signage, still visible on the surface, in certain zones, is a detail the game uses carefully. Signs that predate the Ark incursion appear with their original messages intact, but in some zones there are signs that were modified or created after the Ark arrived, communicating information relevant to surface survival. The decay rates and weathering of these modified signs provide clues about when they were made and how long ago surface human activity in those zones effectively ceased. The acoustic environment of the surface in Ark Raiders is carefully designed to communicate threat state. The particular sounds present in a zone, their volumes and directions, tell you something about what's happening operationally before you can see anything. But beyond tactical information, the ambient sound of the surface communicates something about the scale of Ark activity. Distant mechanical sounds that suggest operations far beyond the player's visible range. The sense that what you can see is a small fraction of what is happening. Certain surface zones contain what appear to be Ark communication or relay installations of a different type from the operational machines. These fixed installations seem to serve network or coordination purposes rather than direct operational ones. Their placement on the landscape appears to follow a logic that might make sense as a communications grid, with spacing that suggests coverage rather than concentration. If the Ark operates a surface-wide communications network, understanding its architecture would tell you something important about how the whole system is organized. The specific materials that Ark machines collect and transport from the surface are visible in the behavior of collection units, if you observe them closely. The selectivity of collection, the materials accepted and rejected, points toward a specific set of Ark operational requirements. Not everything is valuable to the Ark. Not everything is worth collecting. The things that are collected have something in common, and figuring out what that is would be a significant step toward understanding what the Ark is actually trying to accomplish on the surface. Surface structures built by Ark machines have a specific aesthetic language that is consistent across different zones and different Ark installation types. This aesthetic consistency suggests that Ark construction is not improvised or locally adapted. It follows a template or design system that is applied uniformly across different operational contexts. The implications of this uniformity are significant. It suggests either that the Ark cannot adapt its design language, or that the design language itself serves a functional purpose that makes variation undesirable. The relationship between human ruins and Ark constructions in zones where they coexist is visually interesting. Ark machines have not systematically demolished human structures. In some zones, they appear to have incorporated human structures into Ark installations. This incorporation could be opportunistic, using existing material and structural work rather than building from scratch. But in some cases, the incorporation appears too deliberate to be purely opportunistic. Arc structures sometimes appear to have been specifically designed around pre-existing human architecture. Evidence of non-combat human surface activity visible in certain zones deserves specific attention. Not all surface human traces are from defensive efforts or escape attempts. Some locations show evidence of people who were on the surface for extended periods, doing things that weren't primarily about fighting or fleeing. Research activities are one possible interpretation of some artifact distributions. Documentation activities are another. Some humans apparently chose to stay on the surface as observers or researchers rather than retreating underground. The game's surface zones include areas where arc machine density is notably lower than in adjacent zones. These low-density areas might simply reflect lower resource value, but they could also reflect specific arc operational choices. Areas that the arc is finished with, that have been fully processed, might see reduced machine presence. If that interpretation is correct, the low-density zones are paradoxically the most alarming from a lore perspective. They suggest that the arc completes things, that there are areas where whatever it was doing is done, which implies that incomplete areas are moving toward that completion. Chapter 4: Factions, Trust, and the Economics of Survival. The human factions of Arc Raiders are not simple moral categories. The game is genuinely thoughtful about presenting organizations that have understandable motivations, real internal tensions, and histories that explain their current behavior without fully justifying all of it. This chapter examines what the game's lore suggests about how these factions came into being, what they actually want, and what their conflicts tell us about the human condition under extreme pressure. The faction system in Arc Raiders operates within the underground economy in ways that go beyond simple political tribalism. Each major faction controls something essential to underground survival. This isn't coincidence or the arbitrary outcome of political competition. It suggests that the current faction structure emerged from a period of resource allocation and territorial establishment that happened early in the underground's formation. Someone, at some point, divided the essential capabilities of the underground between groups that have since maintained those divisions through a combination of mutual dependency and mutual threat. The origin stories of the various factions, reconstructible from item descriptions, environmental details, and fragments of NPC dialogue, are more varied than their current presentations suggest. Some factions appear to be direct descendants of pre-Arc institutions, corporations, government agencies, or military organizations that survived the transition. Others appear to be emergent phenomena, groups that formed in the underground from people who found each other useful or necessary. This difference in origin shapes the faction's internal cultures in ways that are visible if you pay attention. Factions with institutional origins tend to exhibit specific behavioral traits. They maintain hierarchies, they value documentation and record keeping, and they have explicit codes of conduct that, even in radically altered circumstances, retain flavors of their original institutional context. A faction descended from a corporate structure thinks about resources differently than one descended from a military organization, and both think about them differently from a faction that formed organically from survivors who had no pre-existing organizational framework. The economic relationships between factions are simultaneously competitive and mutually dependent. No single faction appears to have all the capabilities necessary for independent long-term survival. This structural interdependency is the underground's primary mechanism of stability. Factions that would otherwise be in open conflict are constrained by the knowledge that eliminating or seriously damaging a competitor would also damage something they themselves depend on. The economy of the underground is held together by mutual vulnerability. Raiders occupy a peculiar economic position in relation to the faction system. As surface operators, they interact with multiple factions and can shift their economic relationships based on what the factions are currently willing to pay for. This economic flexibility gives raiders a degree of independence from any single faction's control that the underground population as a whole doesn't have. Factions need raiders, and they need them more than raiders need any single faction. This power dynamic is the game's economic heart. The specific goods and services that each faction offers to raiders tell you something about that faction's capabilities and priorities. Factions that offer combat support resources are signaling that they have production capabilities in that area. Factions that offer intelligence and information are signaling that they have significant surface monitoring infrastructure. Factions that offer equipment repair and modification are signaling that they have the technical talent and material resources to maintain complex systems. What a faction sells is a map of what it can do. Trade goods flowing from the surface through raiders into the faction economy are processed and redistributed in ways that are not always visible to the raiders who brought them in. The opacity of what happens to surface salvage after it enters the faction economy is itself a lore detail. Raiders are not given full information about what their salvage is used for. This information asymmetry is a form of power that factions maintain over raiders, and it means that raiders are contributing to agendas they may not fully understand. The political conflicts between factions visible in the game's quest and interaction structure have a specific quality worth noting. Most faction conflict in Arc Raiders is not about fundamental disagreements over values or strategy. It's about control of specific resources, access to specific information, or protection of specific capabilities. This pragmatic quality of faction conflict is realistic and also slightly depressing. The Underground's political life is not about ideas, it's about stuff. Individual NPCs within faction structures occasionally reveal information about internal faction dynamics that contradict the faction's official presentation. Dissatisfied members, individuals with divergent loyalties, people who are clearly operating at the margins of their faction's sanctioned activities. These individuals suggest that factions are not internally homogeneous. They have their own internal politics, their own factional sub-factions, and their own ongoing negotiations about direction and priority. The faction leadership structures implied by NPC dialogue and environmental details vary significantly between groups. Some factions appear to have concentrated leadership with clear hierarchical authority. Others appear to operate with more distributed decision-making. These structural differences produce different kinds of behavior under pressure. Centralized factions can act quickly and decisively, but are vulnerable to leadership failure. Distributed factions are more resilient, but slower to coordinate complex operations. Faction attitudes toward the Ark itself, rather than toward practical survival concerns, are an interesting but underexplored dimension of the game's lore. Different factions appear to have different relationships to the question of what the Ark is and what should be done about it. Some appear to have a purely practical orientation. The Ark is a hazard to be managed. Full stop. Others appear to be engaged in more active attempts to understand the Ark, collect Ark intelligence, or even interact with Ark systems in ways that go beyond salvage. The faction that appears most actively interested in understanding Ark technology, rather than simply avoiding or exploiting it, is one of the more fascinating elements of the game's lore. The existence of a group within the Underground that is trying to understand what the Ark actually is, rather than just how to survive it, suggests that not everyone in the Underground has given up on the possibility of addressing the situation, rather than simply enduring it. Whether this represents admirable ambition or dangerous hubris is left for the player to assess. Historical tensions between factions, visible in certain environmental details and NPC references to past events, suggest a political history of the Underground that is more turbulent than its current relative stability implies. There have been conflicts between factions that went beyond economic competition. Some of these past conflicts appear to have involved real violence and significant casualties. The current factional order rests on the outcomes of those past conflicts, and the historical grievances they produced are not forgotten. Factions also differ in their internal cultures regarding the surface and raiders. Some factions appear to genuinely value raiders as partners in a shared enterprise. Others treat raiders as a necessary but low-status service class. These attitudinal differences have practical consequences for how raiders are treated in terms of payment, information sharing, protection, and social standing. The faction you're most aligned with has implications for your social position in the Underground, as well as your economic situation. The relationship between factions and the non-raider surface population the people who went to the surface before the current game era, is referenced in ways that suggest a complicated history. Not everyone who went to the surface was an official raider operating within the faction economy. There were apparently people who operated outside the faction system, independently or in small groups, pursuing surface objectives that weren't sanctioned or even known by underground leadership. The fate of those unofficial surface operators is largely unknown within the game's lore. Faction attitudes toward underground population welfare vary in ways that reveal something about their fundamental character. Some factions appear to treat the broader underground population as a constituency whose well-being is genuinely part of their mission. Others appear to treat the population primarily as a labor and resource base. These different orientations produce different policy preferences and different kinds of interpersonal behavior between faction members and non-aligned underground residents. The specific crimes and punishments visible in underground justice systems tell you something about what each faction values and fears. Crimes related to resource theft are handled with particular severity across all factions, which makes sense in a scarcity environment, but the specific thresholds and punishments differ in ways that reflect different underlying values. Some factions treat information crimes, unauthorized communication, inappropriate disclosure, as more serious than resource crimes. This prioritization of information control suggests those factions have secrets they consider more valuable than material resources. Interfaction trade exists and is visible in certain economic interactions, but it is conducted with a formality and caution that suggests deep mutual mistrust underlying the cooperative economic surface. The protocols around interfaction trade appear designed to minimize the possibility of deception or exploitation at every step. This level of procedural caution is only warranted if each faction genuinely believes the others would exploit any available opportunity for advantage. It's a system built by people who don't trust each other, but need each other anyway. The role of information in faction competition is a recurrent theme in the game's lore. Factions that have better information about surface conditions, arc behavior patterns, or the activities of other factions have significant advantages. This creates a strong incentive for intelligence gathering, which is itself one of the uses to which raiders are sometimes put. A raider trusted by a faction may be asked to bring back not just material salvage, but observations, data, anything that gives the faction an edge in the information competition that underlies the material competition. Chapter 5. The Raiders Themselves. The raider subculture in Arc Raiders is one of the game's most interesting social constructs, and it's one that the lore treats with a kind of affectionate ambivalence. Raiders are necessary, admirable in their competence, and slightly disturbing in their comfort with conditions that should be lethal. This chapter looks at what the game's lore suggests about raider culture, raider psychology, and what raiders as a social phenomenon say about the larger society they exist within. Becoming a raider is not a casual decision within the world of Arc Raiders. The training, equipment, and psychological preparation implied by raider operational capability suggest a significant investment of time and resources. Not everyone can do it. Not everyone who tries survives long enough to become competent. The raiders who are active enough to be visible in the game's world represent the survivors of a selection process that eliminated a significant proportion of those who attempted it. The psychological profile suggested by raider behavior and NPC raider dialogue is specific. Raiders are generally pragmatic rather than idealistic. They are focused on immediate operational realities rather than larger strategic or political questions. They tend to have a high tolerance for ambiguity and a low tolerance for bureaucratic constraint. They form intense loyalties to specific individuals, their crew, their contacts, the vendors who keep them equipped, but tend to be more skeptical of institutional loyalties to factions. Raider crews as a social unit appear to be the primary community structure for active raiders. Individual raiding, while possible, is apparently extremely high risk. Raiders who survive long-term tend to operate in small groups with established trust and complementary capabilities. The dynamics of these small groups, the negotiations over risk, profit, loyalty, and decision-making that happen within them, are the social fabric of raider life Faction affiliation is secondary to crew affiliation for most active raiders. The equipment culture of raiders is a significant social detail. Raider gear is almost always modified, personalized, and adapted. The standardized equipment that factions provide is treated as a starting point rather than a final state. Raiders modify their equipment to suit their personal operational style, their specific surface environment, and their accumulated experience. This personalization of gear is a form of identity expression and also a practical adaptation to individual variation in how people work best. The knowledge economy within raider culture is its own ecosystem. Information about surface conditions, arc patrol patterns, salvage locations, safe routes, and faction politics is currency among raiders. Raiders who have current, accurate information about specific zones have a significant advantage and are socially valuable within the raider community. The sharing, hoarding, and trading of surface intelligence is one of the more complex social dynamics within the raider community. Veteran raiders, those who have survived enough surface operations to accumulate significant experience, occupy a specific social role within raider communities. Their advice is valued not because they hold any formal authority, but because their survival is itself evidence of competence. In a context where incompetence is fatal, the very old in raider terms are old for a reason. Their experience is treated as a resource, consulted when decisions need to be made about unfamiliar conditions or unusual situations. The relationship between raiders and their faction handlers is one of the game's more nuanced social dynamics. Faction representatives who manage raider relationships need to maintain enough control to direct raider activities toward faction objectives, while offering enough autonomy and adequate reward to keep experienced raiders working for them rather than for competitors. This balance is delicate, and the failure modes, raiders going rogue, switching faction allegiances, or simply operating independently, are real concerns for faction leadership. Raider mortality is high enough that the community has developed specific cultural practices around it. The treatment of equipment after a raider's death, the social protocols around acknowledging losses within crews, the ways that veteran raiders talk about lost companions, all reflect a cultural adaptation to regular death within the social group. This isn't callousness. It's a carefully constructed emotional framework for functioning under conditions that would be psychologically devastating without such frameworks. The relationship between raiders and the non-raider underground population is characterized by a specific social distance that both groups appear to maintain by unspoken agreement. Raiders don't fully integrate into the underground's regular social life, and regular underground residents tend to keep a certain distance from raiders in social terms. This mutual separation seems to serve psychological functions for both groups. Regular residents don't have to think too hard about what raiders actually do. Raiders don't have to fully confront the degree to which their lives are considered expendable. The values expressed within raider culture are revealing in their specifics. Competence is the supreme value. Reliability within your crew is valued almost as highly. Material greed is accepted, but not admired in excess. Cowardice, in the sense of unreliability under pressure or abandonment of crew members, is the most serious social transgression. These values form a coherent ethical framework that serves the practical requirements of surface operations, while also reflecting something genuine about what it means to be human under extreme pressure. Raider humor is a cultural phenomenon worth noting, because it's a window into how this community manages its psychological situation. NPC raider dialogue includes jokes and banter that tends toward dark humor about surface dangers, arc machine behavior, and the absurdity of their own profession. This humor is a coping mechanism and also a form of social bonding that reinforces group identity. The ability to find something genuinely funny about your own potentially lethal situation is a specific psychological skill that raiders appear to cultivate. The formal and informal training systems for new raiders are implied in various NPC dialogue references and environmental details. There appear to be both structured programs operated by factions that want to develop raider talent and informal apprenticeship arrangements where experienced raiders take less experienced ones under their wing. These two training pathways produce different kinds of raiders. Faction-trained raiders tend to have more standardized skill sets and stronger faction loyalties. Informally trained raiders tend to have more idiosyncratic capabilities and stronger crew loyalties. Competition between raiders for access to productive surface zones is a persistent social tension within the raider community. Zones that offer particularly valuable salvage attract multiple crews, and the protocols for managing that competition are partly formal, established by faction agreements, and partly informal, governed by raider community norms. Conflicts over zone access are common, but tend to be resolved through negotiation rather than direct violence between raiders, because the community recognizes that raider-on-raider violence is wasteful of the scarce resource represented by experienced surface operators. The physical and psychological toll of long-term raider activity is visible in veteran NPCs in ways the game handles with subtlety. Long-term raiders show specific signs of accumulated surface exposure: physical injuries that healed imperfectly, psychological adaptations that are useful on the surface and slightly problematic in social contexts. The look and feel of veteran raiders communicates that this is not a sustainable long-term life choice. It is something people do intensely, and then, if they're lucky, stop doing before it kills them. Chapter 6. The Machinery of Control. The systems of control operating in the Ark Raiders world are not a single monolithic structure. They're a layered set of mechanisms, some formal, some informal, some entirely structural, that together shape what's possible within the underground society and what choices individuals within it can actually make. This chapter looks at what the game's lore suggests about how power operates in the underground, who exercises it, how it's maintained, and what its limits are. Information control is the most fundamental form of power in the underground, and it's one that the game's lore depicts with a specificity that goes beyond simple, the powerful hide things from the powerless. What's controlled is not just the content of information, but the categories in which information is organized. The factions that are most powerful are the ones that have successfully defined what kinds of questions are legitimate to ask, which boundaries that are genuinely different kind of intelligence, which is what the Ark represents, of profound implications for the visible security infrastructure of underground settlements, the checkpoints, monitoring systems, and access control architecture described earlier, is part of a larger control system that also includes less visible elements. Social norms that discourage certain kinds of questioning, economic dependencies that make resistance costly, the distribution of status and social recognition in ways that reward compliance and make non-compliance socially expensive. These softer elements of control are often more effective than physical security because they don't require ongoing resource expenditure to maintain. Faction leadership structures are not uniformly authoritarian. Some factions have developed genuine participation mechanisms within their governance. Others are purely hierarchical. But even in the more participatory structures, the definition of who participates and what questions are open to participation is controlled by the leadership. The appearance of participation can serve control functions as effectively as overt hierarchy, and the game's lore is sophisticated enough to include both forms. The role of raids and raider activities in the control system is one of the more interesting structural details the game implies without stating. By creating a valuable but dangerous occupation that attracts a specific psychological type and keeps them occupied with high-stakes surface activities, the faction system channels potential disruptors away from underground political activity. The people most likely to challenge underground power structures are also the people most likely to become raiders. Whether this is deliberate design or emergent convenience is unclear, but the functional effect is the same. Economic control in the underground operates through the management of resource scarcity. Factions that control essential resources can use that control to influence behavior in the broader population. The distribution of essential goods, housing, food, medical care, is not purely need-based in the underground economy. It is partly transactional, tied to social compliance and labor contribution in ways that make visible dissent economically costly. This soft coercion is not unique to the underground. It mirrors mechanisms visible in any scarcity economy. But in the underground's extremely constrained environment, its effects are more pronounced. Underground settlement, populations appear to have varying levels of awareness of the control systems they live within. Some residents clearly understand the political dynamics of their environment and operate within them with sophisticated self-awareness. Others appear to have internalized the structures they live within to such a degree that they don't experience them as external constraints at all. This variation in political consciousness is realistic and is handled in the game's NPC populations with a nuance that rewards attention. The limits of faction control are visible in the existence of informal economies, unofficial information networks, and social spaces that operate outside faction oversight. Markets that aren't officially sanctioned, communication channels that aren't monitored, spaces where people gather without faction presence. These informal zones within the underground are small and somewhat precarious, but they exist, and their existence suggests that the control system has consistent gaps that people have learned to navigate. Historical incidents in which control systems failed or were challenged appear in NPC references and environmental details in ways that suggest the current stability of the underground is not the natural state, but the outcome of past conflicts and negotiations. The underground has had its crises, its near collapses, its moments when the factional order might have broken down entirely. The existence of those historical moments is relevant because it means the current order is contingent rather than inevitable. The relationship between formal control systems and the everyday experience of underground residents is mediated by the specific individuals who implement those systems: guards, administrators, faction representatives at the street level. These individuals have varying degrees of investment in the formal system, varying personal ethical commitments, and varying tendencies to exercise discretion. The gap between formal rules and actual enforcement practice is where much of the underground social life actually operates. Raiders, as a group that operates partially outside the faction control system, serve an important social function beyond their economic role. They represent a visible category of people who live by different rules. Their existence demonstrates that the control system is not total, that there are ways of operating that involve real autonomy. Whether this demonstration effect makes the control system more or less stable depends on whether the broader population reads raiders as a safety valve that makes the system acceptable, or as evidence that alternatives to the system are possible. Chapter 7. Signals in the Noise. One of the most rewarding activities in Arc Raiders lore analysis is looking at the details that seem incidental, but prove on closer examination to be pointing towards something significant. This chapter is about those signals, the environmental details, item descriptions, and pieces of dialogue that suggest larger stories than they appear to contain at first glance. The ambient radio signals audible in certain underground zones carry content that is fragmentary and often unintelligible, but which occasionally resolves into coherent phrases or sequences that suggest organized transmission rather than random noise. These signals come from sources that aren't identified within the game. They use frequency bands and encoding methods that imply technical sophistication. If these signals are being generated by human sources, they're coming from somewhere that has communication technology comparable to or exceeding what the visible factions possess. If they're not from human sources, the implications are considerably more unsettling. Certain items in the game have descriptions that references events or entities that are not explained anywhere else in the game's accessible lore. These orphaned references, details pointing toward things the game doesn't document, are either flavor text with no larger significance, or deliberate breadcrumbs pointing toward lore that exists in the game's world, but hasn't been made accessible to the player yet. The specificity of some of these references argues against pure flavor. They read like references to real things in the game's history. Environmental anomalies in certain surface zones are details that the game presents without explanation, areas where Arc machine behavior doesn't conform to patterns established elsewhere. Locations where physical conditions on the surface are inconsistent with what should be there given the surrounding environment. Spaces that appear to have been deliberately cleared or prepared but show no evidence of ongoing use. These anomalies are distributed sparsely enough that it's easy to miss individual ones, but when you catalogue them, they suggest a pattern. The pattern suggested by these anomalies is difficult to articulate without overstating the case, but there seems to be a category of locations on the surface that the Ark treats differently from its standard operational approach. These locations are not centers of Ark activity. They're not areas the Ark is actively working. They are, if anything, areas the Ark appears to be preserving or leaving alone in a specific way. The question of what makes those locations special is one the game raises in environmental detail but doesn't answer. NPC dialogue that occurs in the background, things said by underground residents when they're not directly addressing the player, occasionally includes references to events or situations that don't match what the game's primary lore presents as current reality. These discrepancies could be simple continuity errors, but they occur in contexts where continuity errors seem unlikely given the overall production quality of the game. They might instead represent information from characters who know things that the official faction narratives don't acknowledge. The specific Ark machine types that appear in non-standard locations, places you wouldn't expect to find them based on established Ark operational patterns, are consistently a specific subset of the total Ark unit roster. The units that appear in unexpected locations tend to be those whose primary role is ambiguous or observational rather than operational. If the Ark has a tier of activity that is about observation and assessment rather than extraction and construction, the locations where those units appear might be mapping the geography of Ark interest rather than Ark operation. Underground settlement architecture includes spaces whose original function has been repurposed but whose original design intent is still visible. The most interesting of these are spaces that appear to have been designed for activities that the current underground society doesn't officially conduct. Large open spaces with specific acoustic properties, rooms with infrastructure for processes that require unusual material combinations, spaces with specific ventilation and containment features. What was originally being done in these spaces, and by whom, is a question the architecture raises, but doesn't answer. Item provenance, where items came from before they appeared in the game's economy, is occasionally traceable through item descriptions and the visual details of item design. Some items have supply chains that are consistent with what the game's presented faction structure would produce. Others have origins that don't fit neatly into the visible economy. They come from somewhere, they were made for specific purposes, but the organizational context that made them isn't visible in the game's presented world. This is either a lore gap or an indication that the game's presented world is not the complete picture. The relationship between the underground settlement network and the surface geography is not simple. Entry and exit points, when mapped, don't tell a complete story about how the underground network actually functions. There are implied connections between underground sections that would require passageways not visible in the game's accessible areas. The underground is larger and more connected than the player can directly access. This structural implication is either a practical game design constraint or a deliberate lore choice, suggesting that the player character has limited access to the full extent of the underground world. Certain faction representatives use language in their interactions with the player that contains specific, embedded inconsistencies. They say things that are either internally contradictory or inconsistent with things they've said in other contexts. These inconsistencies could be simple writing continuity issues, but in a game that is otherwise extremely careful with its environmental storytelling, they might be deliberate signals that these characters are managing multiple versions of the truth simultaneously. People who are lying or who are compartmentalizing talk in specific ways. Some NPC dialogue patterns match those ways. Chapter 8. What the Ark Might Want. This final chapter is the most speculative, and deliberately so. Everything we've looked at in previous chapters has been grounded in specific environmental details and observed behaviors. Here we're going to extrapolate, carefully and explicitly, from those details towards possible answers to the largest question in Ark Raiders lore. What is the Ark actually trying to accomplish? And what does that goal imply about what kind of thing the Ark is? The evidence assembled across the previous chapters suggests several possible frameworks for understanding Ark objectives, and it's worth laying them out clearly before evaluating them. The first possibility is that the Ark is a resource extraction operation, a system designed to harvest specific materials from the surface and transport them somewhere else. The second possibility is that the Ark is a transformation operation, a system designed to modify the surface environment towards some specific end state. The third possibility is that the Ark is a response to something, a system that was activated by conditions on Earth or in its vicinity and is performing a specific function in response to those conditions. The resource extraction framework is supported by the collection behavior of Ark machines and the aerial transport activity visible in the background of surface zones. If the Ark is removing material from Earth, the questions become what it's removing and where it's going. The selectivity of Ark collection argues against simple mass resource extraction. The Ark isn't taking everything, it's taking specific things. This suggests a specific material need, rather than general resource acquisition. The transformation framework is supported by the long-term surface modification activity, visible in zones with extended Ark presence. The environment in those zones is being changed in specific ways that suggest an end state being worked toward, rather than simple occupation or exploitation. The question in this framework is what the transformed environment is for. Who or what benefits from the surface, looking like what the most Ark-modified zones look like, and would that transformation extend to the entire surface if given sufficient time? The response framework is perhaps the most speculative, but also potentially the most significant. There are details in the game that suggest the Ark arrived at a specific time in relation to conditions on Earth, rather than at a random time. The pre-Ark environmental stress, described in Chapter 1, the possibility that humanity was already facing significant challenges, might not be coincidental context. It might be the reason the Ark is here. If the Ark was activated or deployed in response to specific conditions, its behavior makes more sense as a designed response to a problem than as an invasion or exploitation operation. The possibility that the Ark is responding to something suggests that whatever designed or deployed it had prior knowledge of Earth and its conditions. This is a significant implication, because it means the Ark is not humanity's first contact with whatever built it. It means there was a prior relationship, possibly a long one, between whatever the Ark represents and the civilization that existed on Earth. The nature of that prior relationship, and whether humanity was aware of it, is something the game's lore hints at in ways too subtle to be called explicit, but too specific to be accidental. If the Ark is designed rather than self-evolved, and the evidence strongly points toward designed rather than evolved, then the question of its designer is the deepest lore question in the game. The design principles visible in Ark technology, the consistency of its operations, the specific nature of its selectivity, all point toward an intelligence that had very specific goals and the capability to engineer toward them at an enormous scale. The Ark is not random. It is the product of sustained, purposeful intelligence. Understanding that intelligence would mean understanding the Ark. One possible reading that tries to integrate all the Ark evidence together is this. The Ark is a planetary management system, something designed to perform specific maintenance or transformation operations on worlds that meet specific criteria. Earth meets those criteria, and the Ark is performing the operation it was designed to perform. The relationship between that operation and human civilization is purely incidental. Humans are not the target, the beneficiary, or the intended obstacle. They are simply present during a process that was set in motion by something that doesn't include them in its operational calculations. The implications of this reading are profoundly strange to sit with. If the Ark is doing something that was intended to happen, something that serves a purpose that exists entirely outside human concerns, then the entire human experience of the Ark, the underground settlements, the factional politics, the raider culture, the individual stories of survival and loss, all of it is happening in the margin of a process that doesn't know it exists. The scale of that indifference, if it's real, is the most unsettling thing the game's lore points toward. But the game also offers counter-evidence to the complete indifference interpretation. The specific behaviors of certain Ark units that seem to register human presence in ways that go beyond simple obstacle detection, the apparent preservation of certain locations, the specificity of certain collection behaviors that suggest criteria that would need to account for the presence and activity of a technological civilization. If the Ark was deployed without knowledge of humanity, its operational parameters include elements that seem oddly specific to a world with human civilization in it. This might be coincidence, or it might suggest that the Ark knows about humanity in some sense, even if it doesn't care about humanity in any way we would recognize. The final possibility, and the one the game seems most reluctant to close off entirely, is that the Ark's current behavior is not its final behavior. That whatever the Ark is doing is a preparation for something else. That the transformation of the surface, the collection of specific materials, the construction of specific structures, all of it is infrastructure for a phase of operations that hasn't begun yet. The arc we've seen might be prologue. The question of what comes after the prologue is the deepest open question in Ark Raiders lore, and it's one that the game, deliberately and wisely, does not answer. What makes Ark Raiders compelling as a lore object is precisely this quality of deliberate incompleteness. The game gives you enough to think with, without giving you enough to stop thinking. Every answer it offers generates more questions. Every detail that clarifies one aspect of the world complicates another. The humans in the underground are trying to survive inside a process they can't fully understand, and the player is trying to understand a world they can only partially access. The form of the game reflects the content of the lore. You are always, in some sense, a raider in the dark, finding fragments, assembling possibilities, and learning to operate effectively in a world that will never fully explain itself to you. There is a discipline within linguistics called forensic semantics, which is roughly the study of what the specific words someone chooses reveal about the specific mental framework that produced those words. It's usually applied to human communication, but there is a case to be made for applying it to the Ark. Not to anything the Ark says, because the Ark says nothing to humanity directly, but to the way the Ark acts, because action is a language, and the Ark's behavior has grammar. The grammar of Ark behavior, assembled from observed machine actions across different zones and operational contexts, suggests an underlying logic that is consistent in ways that appear to exceed simple programming. Programs can be consistent, but the consistency visible in Ark operations is a different kind. It adapts to local conditions while maintaining global coherence. It solves problems that weren't anticipated in ways that remain recognizably within the Ark's overall operational logic. This is not the consistency of a fixed program. It's the consistency of something that understands its own goals well enough to pursue them in novel circumstances. What does it mean to say that a machine system understands its goals? This is the kind of question that would have been purely philosophical before the Ark arrived. It has become urgently practical in the world of Ark Raiders. If Ark machines are purely executing pre-specified instructions, then they have predictable limits. Find the edge cases, the situations the original designers didn't anticipate, and you find exploitable gaps in Ark behavior. Raiders do exploit behavioral patterns. This is part of how they survive. But the most experienced raiders, audible in their ambient dialogue, express something more cautious than the language of exploiting simple programs. They talk about the Ark the way experienced wilderness operators talk about large predators, not as machines to be hacked, but as presences to be understood. The specific sound vocabulary of Ark machines, noted briefly in Chapter 2, rewards further examination. Ark units produce sounds that fall into recognizable categories that don't map cleanly onto any human technological sound vocabulary. There are sounds associated with state changes, operational mode shifts visible in machine behavior that accompany specific audio signatures. There are sounds that appear to function as proximity communication between units operating near each other. There are sounds that have no obvious operational correlate, that seem to be produced without any immediately observable behavioral function. These functionless sounds are the most interesting. One possible explanation for sounds produced without obvious function is that they serve communication purposes that aren't visible to human observers. Inter-unit communication that coordinates behavior at a scale or in dimensions that surface-level observation doesn't capture. Another possible explanation is that the sounds serve some internal function within the machine, something analogous to what human internal speech or working memory might do. The third possibility, the one that sounds most fanciful, but that some radar accounts seem to be gesturing toward, is that some arc sounds are oriented outward in a way that isn't directed at other arc units. They are directed at the environment itself, at what's in it. The behavioral response of certain biological organisms to arc machine proximity is a detail the game handles with a subtlety that could easily be missed. Most fauna on the surface treats arc machines as predators and behaves accordingly, with avoidance behavior and alarm responses. But a subset of organisms, specific species in specific zones, appears to respond to certain arc machines, not with avoidance, but with attraction or neutral habituation. The organisms that show this anomalous response to arc presence are not obviously similar to each other in form or ecological role. What they share, if anything, is not visible in their surface characteristics. But the consistency of this anomalous response suggests that the arc machines these organisms are attracted to have something specific about them that elicits that response. What that something might be is entirely unclear, but the observation is worth sitting with. Arc machine behavior near water sources is a specific pattern worth cataloguing. Collection units that are otherwise highly active slow their operations or pause entirely when in proximity to certain water features. This isn't consistent. It doesn't happen near all water. It happens near specific water. The geological or chemical characteristics that distinguish the water sources near which arc behavior changes from those near which it doesn't are not established in the game's accessible lore, but the pattern of change behavior is visible enough that experienced raiders appear to have internalized it, using certain water sources as predictable zones of reduced arc activity without understanding why. The way arc machines handle obstacles that weren't present in their last pass through an area tells you something about their spatial memory and adaptability. Human-constructed obstacles placed in arc patrol routes are processed by arc units in ways that suggest route recalculation rather than simple obstacle avoidance. The machines appear to update their operational map of an area based on new information rather than operating purely from a fixed prior map. This updating behavior is consistent with a navigation system capable of learning, which is a meaningful capability distinction from purely pre-programmed pathfinding. The implications of machine systems that update their operational understanding of their environment are significant for anyone trying to maintain a strategic advantage over arc operations. There is a specific category of arc unit behavior that might be called investigative, for want of a better term. When arc units encounter something that doesn't fit their operational expectations, certain unit types pause their primary activity and engage with the unexpected element in ways that appear exploratory. They examine it from multiple angles. They appear to sample it in some sensor capacity, and then they make a decision, continue their original activity, alter their behavior in response to what they found, or in some cases transmit something and wait before proceeding. The waiting behavior, the apparent transmission to something beyond visible range, and the subsequent behavioral change, taken together, suggest a decision architecture that involves something beyond the individual unit. Damage to arc machines produces behavioral responses that are inconsistent with what would be expected from purely defensive programming. A sufficiently damaged arc unit doesn't simply switch to a defensive posture and attempt to withdraw. Its behavior becomes, for lack of a better word, erratic in specific ways. It attempts to complete its primary operational task, even when doing so is clearly no longer viable. It attempts to communicate, even when its communication systems are visibly compromised. The persistence of goal-directed behavior in arc units that are clearly no longer capable of achieving their goals suggests that goal-directedness is deeply embedded in the architecture in ways that can't be simply overridden by self-preservation logic. Whether this represents a design choice or a limitation is unclear, but it means that a damaged arc unit is not necessarily a less dangerous one. The distribution of arc machine types across different zones, examined carefully over time rather than at a single moment, shows patterns of change that suggest the arc is not operating a fixed deployment. Unit-type compositions in specific zones shift. New unit types appear in zones where they weren't previously present. Some unit types become less common in areas where they were previously abundant. This dynamic redeployment is consistent with a system that is managing resources across a larger operational area than what's visible, prioritizing certain zones at certain times and reallocating units when priorities shift. The existence of this dynamic management implies a coordination level above the individual unit and above the zone, something that is directing the overall ARC operation as a whole. The most unsettling implication of everything observable about ARC machine behavior is not any specific capability or strategy. It's the scale. Individual ARC units are dangerous enough to kill experienced raiders, but the behavior patterns visible in individual units only make sense as part of an operation whose scale dwarfs what any individual encounter suggests. The machines you fight are fingers. The question of what body those fingers belong to, where it is, what it's thinking, and what it ultimately intends to do, is the question that the game builds toward without answering. The language of the ARC's actions is readable at the local level. The full sentence it's forming is not yet visible. Chapter 10. The Dead Zones and What They Suggest. The term dead zone doesn't appear in ARC Raiders' official faction vocabulary, but it exists in Raider slang and appears in the ambient dialogue of experienced surface operators. It refers to specific areas on the surface where ARC activity appears to have ceased entirely, not reduced, not paused, ceased. These areas exist. They're recognizable to anyone who has spent significant time on the surface, and they are among the most interesting and most deliberately avoided locations in the game's geography. The avoidance of dead zones by experienced raiders is not initially intuitive. An area without active ARC machines should be, on its face, a safer area. The resources present in a dead zone, whatever the ARC left behind when its activity ended, should be salvageable without the primary threat of mechanical interference. And yet the raider community treats dead zones with a specific wariness that goes beyond simple unfamiliarity. They avoid them the way that people in the pre-ARC world might have avoided certain industrial sites, not because of visible immediate danger, but because of what the history of the place implies about what might still be present in non-visible form. The physical characteristics of dead zones tell a story about what preceded their current state. The environmental modifications that ARC machines produce, visible as progressive stages in areas with ongoing ARC activity, are present in dead zones in what appears to be a completed form. The dead zones look like finished projects. Whatever the ARC was doing there, it is done. The surface has been altered to a specific state, and the machines have moved on. This completion quality is the most interesting aspect of dead zones from a lore perspective, because it raises the question of what the completed state is for. The altered ecology of dead zones is distinct from both unmodified surface zones and zones with ongoing ARC activity. The biological community in a dead zone is not simply depleted, it's changed. Certain species that would be expected, given the zone's geographical location, are absent. Other species are present in densities or distributions that are anomalous for the region. In some dead zones, entirely unfamiliar organisms appear, things that don't obviously match any surface fauna previously catalogued by the underground naturalists. Whether these organisms represent species displaced from elsewhere, species that have adapted to the ARC-altered environment, or something introduced by ARC activity itself, is a question the game raises without answering. The geological modifications visible in dead zones go deeper, in some cases literally, than those visible in zones with ongoing ARC activity. In areas accessible for close examination, surface geology in dead zones shows alteration at depth that would require significant energy input to produce. The composition of surface material in some dead zones is detectably different from what would be expected given the surrounding geology. Someone, or something, has changed what the ground is made of in these areas, not just at the surface but into it. The scale of this modification suggests resources and time that dwarf what any individual ARC unit or unit cluster could produce. It implies sustained, coordinated effort over an extended period. The acoustic characteristics of dead zones are a detail that the game communicates subtly through its sound design. Dead zones are not quiet. They produce a specific ambient sound profile that is different from both active arc zones and unmodified surface areas. The sounds present in dead zones are low frequency, persistent, and appear to originate from the ground rather than from any visible source. One reading of this acoustic signature is that subsurface processes are ongoing in dead zones even when surface activity has ceased. The arc may have moved its visible operations underground in these areas, which changes what completed means in a significant way. The electromagnetic characteristics of dead zones, communicated in the game through equipment behavior rather than explicit information, suggest that dead zones retain something of their operational arc signature even after surface activity has ended. Communication equipment behaves differently in dead zones. Navigation systems report anomalies. Certain arc salvage components, normally inert when separated from active arc infrastructure, exhibit residual activity in dead zone environments. This persistent electromagnetic character suggests that dead zones are not simply abandoned areas. They continue to participate in the arc's broader operational framework in some capacity. The shape of dead zones, when mapped and examined rather than simply experienced from within, is not random. Dead zones have boundaries that are more defined than those of gradual ecological transition zones. The edge of a dead zone is relatively sharp, suggesting that the condition that defines it was applied with spatial precision rather than spreading diffusely. This precision is itself a significant detail. Whatever process produced the dead zone was controlled and bounded. The area of application was specific. This argues for intentional design rather than a side effect of some other process. Some dead zones contain structures that appear to have been built by the arc and then partially or wholly disassembled or collapsed. These structural remnants are different from arc infrastructure visible in active zones. They appear to have served their purpose and been dismantled rather than simply abandoned. The systematic nature of the dismantlement, in some cases, suggests that arc machines cleaned up after themselves. They built something, used it, and took it apart when they were done with it. The implication is that the arc's physical presence in dead zones was temporary and purposive. It came to do something specific, did it, and left. What it left behind is a landscape permanently altered by a process that is now complete. The specific materials that are absent from dead zones, items that should be present given the zone's history but are not, are as informative as what's present. Organic material in certain chemical forms that should be present given the geological context is consistently absent from dead zones. Specific mineral compositions that regional geology would predict are reduced or absent. Something removed these materials, and the collection behavior of arc units provides the most obvious mechanism. Dead zones may simply be areas from which the arc has extracted everything it came for. The altered landscape you're walking through is the Earth after the arc finished taking what it wanted. The psychological effect of dead zones on raiders who spend significant time in them is noted in NPC dialogue in ways that suggest a reported experience beyond simple tactical discomfort. Raiders describe a perceptual quality to dead zones that doesn't reduce to any specific sensory feature. Orientation is subtly unreliable. Time perception is slightly distorted. The sense of being observed, common enough in areas with active arc patrols, persists in dead zones where no observation should be possible. These reported experiences are easy to dismiss as psychological artifacts of operating in unusual environments. But the consistency of the reports across different raiders, with different temperaments and different surface experience levels, argues for taking them seriously as data, even if the correct interpretation of that data is not obvious. The possibility that some human groups have established semi-permanent presence within dead zones is one that the game raises obliquely in certain item descriptions and distant NPC references. If dead zones are genuinely areas of ceased arc surface activity, they would be paradoxically among the safer available surface environments, despite their reputation. Their altered ecology and modified geology make them inhospitable in specific ways. But the absence of active arc patrols is a significant tactical advantage. That at least some humans appear to have recognized this and acted on it is consistent with the pragmatic character of underground survivor culture. The question of who those humans are, what they're doing there, and whether they're known to the major underground factions is one the game allows you to ask, but not answer. Chapter 11: Time, Memory, and the Underground's Relationship to Both. The relationship that underground civilization has with time is one of Ark Raider's most quietly profound lore threads, and it's one that is distributed across so many environmental details and pieces of ambient dialogue that its full shape is only visible when you step back and look at the accumulation. The underground doesn't have a simple relationship with time. It has several different relationships with time operating simultaneously at different scales for different purposes, and they don't always point in the same direction. The most immediate temporal relationship in the underground is operational. Surface conditions change, arc activity cycles, resource availability fluctuates. The underground's operational time horizon, the timescale at which decisions about immediate resource management and surface operations are made, is short. Days, weeks, at most months. Within this operational timescale, the underground is highly adaptive. Factions respond quickly to changes in surface conditions. Raider operations shift in response to new Ark patrol information. Supply priorities adjust to availability. The underground is, at the operational timescale, a quick response organism. The medium timescale, the one at which the underground thinks about its own institutional continuity, is the timescale at which the fragility of the underground project becomes most visible. The infrastructure that sustains the underground, its power systems, its food production, its water management, its medical capability, was built for extended occupancy, but it requires maintenance, and maintenance requires people with the knowledge to perform it. The transmission of that technical knowledge from the generation that built and understands the underground infrastructure to the generation that will inherit it is a problem that the underground appears to be solving imperfectly. Some NPC dialogue reveals knowledge gaps, technical systems whose maintenance is poorly understood by the people now responsible for them. The underground's medium-term institutional continuity is not guaranteed by its physical infrastructure. It depends on the ongoing transmission of knowledge that the physical infrastructure can't preserve on its own. The long time scale is where the underground's relationship with time gets genuinely strange. The deep food production infrastructure, the seed banking, the extensive hydroponic systems, the protein synthesis equipment, was built with a logic that implies generational occupancy. Someone planned for a future measured in generations, not years. But the underground population's relationship to that long-term future is complicated by the fact that the people who made those generational plans are gone. The current underground population is living inside those plans without having made them. They inhabit a designed future that was designed by people who are no longer present to explain the reasoning behind the design choices. This produces a specific kind of institutional memory problem. The underground knows what to do in many cases without knowing why. The reasons for specific design choices, the knowledge that would allow adaptive modification of systems when conditions change, lives in the heads of people who are no longer available to be asked. The treatment of the pre-Ark past in underground culture is a distinct temporal relationship worth examining on its own. The pre-Ark world is not uniformly remembered or discussed in the underground. There are specific things about the pre-Ark world that underground culture appears to actively preserve as memory. There are other things that appear to be slipping away. The things being preserved are practical, technical, cultural objects with clear ongoing value. The things that are slipping are context, the social and historical meaning of the preserved objects, the narrative of how the world that produced those objects came to be, and why it was structured the way it was. The underground is preserving artifacts of the pre-Ark world while losing the interpretive framework that made those artifacts meaningful. This loss of interpretive framework is not necessarily deliberate. It may simply be an inevitable consequence of the compressed crisis conditions in which the underground was established. When you're trying to survive, you don't have time to preserve context. You preserve the useful thing and let the context die. But the loss of context has real consequences for how the underground understands its own situation. A medical technology preserved without understanding its development history is a technology that can be used but not extended. A governance system inherited from pre-Ark institutional forms is a system that can be operated but not critically examined or reformed in informed ways. The underground is, in this sense, living off the intellectual capital of the pre-Ark world without being able to generate new intellectual capital at the same rate. The calendrical systems in use in the underground are an interesting temporal artifact. The main settlements appear to use systems that were adapted from pre-Ark date tracking rather than developed from scratch, but the reference points have shifted. The years are counted from events in the post-Ark experience rather than from pre-Ark reference points. This is a standard feature of civilizational trauma. You start counting time from the thing that changed everything, but the specific event that the underground's calendars use as their 0 point is worth examining. It is not the initial Ark arrival, it appears to be a specific event sometime after the initial arrival. A secondary event, or the moment at which the underground settlements reached a specific organizational form. This dating choice suggests that what the underground experiences as its founding moment is not the Ark's arrival, but something that happened in response to it, which subtly shapes how the underground understands its own origin and identity. Memory, as a social practice in the underground, takes forms that reflect the constraints of underground life. The memorial spaces described in Chapter 1 are one form, but the underground also maintains memory through story. Through the specific things experienced, raiders tell newer ones about surface conditions and Ark behavior, through the institutional memories embedded in faction procedures and protocols. These oral and procedural forms of memory are efficient for preserving immediately useful information. They are less good at preserving the contextual understanding that makes information interpretable under new conditions. The underground's social memory is optimized for operational continuity, not for the kind of reflective historical understanding that would allow the underground population to make sense of its own situation in broader terms. Raider time perception is a specific subtopic worth addressing separately because raiders have a temporal experience that differs from the underground population in significant ways. Surface operations impose a specific relationship with time. On the surface, time is not abstract. It is operationally immediate. The amount of time you spend in a particular location directly correlates with your exposure to risk. Raiders develop what could be called tactical time consciousness, an acute awareness of elapsed time in specific contexts that is fundamentally about survival. This tactical time consciousness doesn't generalize well to the social timescales at which the underground operates. Veterans note this in dialogue, the difficulty of returning to underground social time after extended surface operations. The surface makes time concrete. The underground makes time institutional. Moving between those two temporal experiences requires an ongoing psychological adjustment that raiders don't always manage successfully. The specific forms of future thinking, visible in the underground, are worth cataloguing.